On the bank side, I wanted to, first of all, thank you very much for coming. This is a really great turnout. We had to do this conference on a very short notice in many ways, and thank you so much for all the interest. We also think that the subject is very exciting. As my colleague Walid mentioned and previous speakers, there is a lot of room for innovation in the agricultural sector in Egypt. But on my side, what I wanted to do is set the context a little bit for why we were very keen to have this event move forward. And let me talk a little bit about findings of previous work that we did last fall here. And my apologies to those who may have seen this already. But I think what the findings of the work that we did talks very well about the shortcomings that we see in the sector and where the digitization and the digital platforms, digital apps, digital services could be coming in. So first of all, as my colleagues already mentioned, let me start with a few numbers in agriculture. I'm sure you know them already, but just set the context. So agriculture, as you know, represents about 13% of GDP and 35% if you include agribusiness. And on our side, we certainly look at the entire space of agriculture, agribusiness. So it's a fairly sizable contribution sector for the economy, obviously. It also provides 23% of employment. Agriculture exports are one of the major sort of export contribution, again, is very sizable. Agriculture exports have grown very well over the past 10 years or so. They've grown from about $500 million US equivalent to about 5 billion currently. Agricultural sector is also, it's very distinct that you basically have two farming systems. You have very small-scale agriculture, as my colleague mentioned, up to about 3 fedans along the Nile River. And you have the large-scale, very sophisticated agriculture in the desert areas. And unfortunately, the Nile River agriculture tends to have quite a bit of inefficiencies in terms of logistics, processing, in terms of also yields on some crops. And agriculture water usage, which is another major area that we saw room for improvement. Agricultural, as you heard, is 85–86% of total water use in the country is for agriculture. Now, why we are so interested in agriculture sector going forward? Because we think that Egypt has a tremendous potential to export a lot more. We've estimated that there is probably room to triple the exports, first of all. But also your domestic market is growing at an amazing pace of about 2 million people a year. And the overall is expected to reach about, overall domestic consumption is expected to reach about 300 million by 2021. Even if you modestly estimate that people spend about 30% on food, you are basically looking at domestic market in the agriculture and food space of about $90 billion. So the presentation is here. Now, so the way we looked at, we approached this work was we consulted private sector and public sector regarding what they see as impediments to increased private investment in agriculture and agribusiness. So we came up with a summary of opportunities and challenges, and we just talked a little bit about the potential. So potential is tremendous. Now, looking at opportunities, what we heard a lot from, and this is results of our consultations, was that obviously Egypt is positioned geographically in an excellent geographic location. We have easy access to major markets in Europe, Arab countries, Africa, South America, you name it. Relatively, the port and sea infrastructure is relatively developed, obviously Suez Canal. The agriculture also provides opportunity to go after the sort of premium markets, in the sense that you can have multiple crops and you can also have extended growing seasons, which means that you can go to the market early or late after everybody else has has had to pull out of the market. You have also very consistent climate, which is a huge benefit for agriculture. I already mentioned the expanding market. The membership was mentioned by private sector a number of times. Membership of free trade agreements that Egypt has And also the trade regulations have been more or less harmonized with its major markets, so it provides a lot of opportunities. Regarding competitive sectors, we thought dairy, horticulture, poultry, and fish are the most competitive. The recent floating, it's actually not so recent anymore, it was 18 months ago, as you know, floating of the Egyptian pound increased the competitiveness of the sector. There has been also, in terms of business environment, that has already improving, but of course there is more room to improve. In terms of licensing processes have been simplified and investment processes have been simplified. And of course Egypt has historic name recognition. Now, it also faces a number of challenges, which has, Egypt overall is no longer seen as a low-cost producer, so it needs another value proposition. The water resources that my colleagues already mentioned are obviously an issue, so some solutions would be very welcome there. Jobs are created mostly in the formal sector, which means that the jobs are often not full-time. They're also low qualified jobs, and skill requirements are very low, therefore does not provide room for personal development. The transport infrastructure is inconsistent. There is fairly low innovation right now in the sector, and I'm talking agriculture, agribusiness sector. High losses, which also my colleagues already mentioned. On average, it's 30% across the sector, and it varies between about 10 and 50% depending on what product you look like. And this is a number that we received from a study that was done by UNIDO and the Dutch Embassy. There is unclear land rights, which discourage investment. Access to finance, in particular for smallholders, is very constrained. There are also very few instruments. There is also very little microfinance. There's also very few financial instruments, innovative financial instruments that would facilitate access of smallholder farmers or, let's say, people in sort of more remote areas. And the factor markets, meaning the input markets, the labor markets, also sometimes do not operate in line with the market mechanisms, which constrains the sector development, obviously. Now, I wanted to mention two global trends which also would have some, let's say, impact or maybe some contribution to the solutions that we would get from this exercise. Would be, first of all, agricultural sector is sort of expanding and becoming a more integrated ecosystem. So we're looking at agricultural processing, production, trade, basically as one chain, which is becoming more and more formalized. And the jobs are coming not so much from the agricultural production, obviously, but there is a lot of interesting jobs coming up in the sort of more upstream agricultural value chain and more sort of auxiliary jobs that grow around the basic production and processing. There's also enormous service potential, as you can see, in terms of finance, input supply, technical advice, and other service provision. We looked at example, this is California. In California, the overall agricultural sector is about $300 billion annually, and it provides almost 3 million jobs. 800 job titles, but there is only basically 200,000 people who work directly in farming. The others are getting jobs from sort of, moving upstream from production. And we listed some of these, I'm not going to go through them, but we listed some of the jobs in support industries, in the actual production, in the processing, distribution, that form then this agricultural ecosystem. The other global trend we wanted to mention was that agriculture is increasing in scale, connectivity, and complexity. And you are looking at things like obviously growing population is growing, so demand is growing. The global population is also becoming richer, so demand for high-end foods and processed foods is growing. Globalization, the export opportunities are increasing. Local producers face competition from imports. There is a lot of consolidation. The formal retail, the sort of power of the formal retail is growing. And the larger volumes also fetch higher prices, which obviously for the smallholder farmers along the Nile Valley present a lot of challenges. The technology is one of the 5 pillars of this sort of future outlook on agricultural system. So R&D development, technological development, digitization of the sector is sort of next logical step in many ways. And also increased regulation in terms of food safety. You need to be able to track the origins of your food, for instance, which may fetch a higher price. And also what happens sort of where the countries are moving, increasingly more developed countries, is not just for export. You have to meet the export requirements, which sometimes are very stringent, but also the domestic markets are becoming more regulated, and people want to eat safer foods. So this is we had the example from India regarding the sort of the growth of the various products. As you can see, it may not be the best chart, but basically what you are looking at, there is about 2% growth in things like cereal market. And when you look at the higher value products and more nutritious foods, such as milk, meat, you are looking at fish, you're looking at growth, annual growth of about 5–6%. Overall, what we did as part of the work, we tried to also a little bit step back mostly because of the natural resource issues. Obviously, the country has, in particular, water. We try to take a step back and see where do we think the sector could be going overall, what could be sort of our overall recommendation to the government. And we saw it's sort of two-pronged really way forward. One is the current or existing agriculture certainly needs to become more efficient. Egypt needs to become more efficient producer and supplier. It needs to benefit from the technological advance, from the global technological advances in digitization, in climate-smart agriculture, in sort of solutions in particular for logistics, which right now tends to yield a lot of losses. The value chain linkages need to strengthen. Right now, we understand that the sector is very fragmented, and obviously there are some value chains that are working, but overall the sector tends to be very fragmented, and the farmers have problems selling their small volumes. We also need to look at cross-sectoral synergies. We need to, and this is, I think, part of why we are all here, and we are looking at what the private sector is doing, what the ICT sector is doing, how to improve logistics. So it needs to be cross-sectoral solution in order to move forward the sector to the next level. And the second was our recommendation, given in particular as I mentioned, the natural resource constraints, for Egypt to become maybe more of a transformation hub, which would mean that you would import raw materials, process, and re-export them or export them, which would provide jobs and incomes to your people, because it's obviously value addition. Then I just wanted to mention, these are the specific recommendations that came out of, there was a lot more recommendations that were presented to the government, but these are the specific recommendations that were very pertinent to our today's discussion. So I think we have 7 of them. One was facilitate farmer cooperation, which would allow farmers more effectively to become sort of links in the value chain. It would also allow more effectively and cheaply reach them with finance, with information, with technical advice, also input provision. It would also allow them to cooperate and do the primary processing, which would allow them to add the value almost at the farm gate. Develop an appropriate ICT systems to improve efficiency of production and logistics along value chains. We really try to, as I said, sort of more look at slicing agriculture sector into specific value chains or specific value chain clusters, if we want to say that way, and what ICT resources, what services can be used in order to improve efficiency at every step of this chain, including logistics, which is a significant issue. International food and quality and safety standards, which would be, for instance, we will have a very interesting presentation on blockchain coming later. It is one possible solution to sort of track the food safety and quality, because, as I mentioned, consumers do look for traceable foods, for which then you can charge a higher price. Public-private dialogue, this was very interesting. We understood that the communication between the sector players and the government may not be always open and effective, and if there would be solutions to improve it, it would be very welcome on our side. Agricultural extension system is another big issue. On many occasions it was mentioned how difficult it is to effectively reach farmers, and we will have 2 presentations later that will talk about how to effectively reach farmers with information and extension advice. Microcredit products, as I mentioned, first of all, there is very little microfinance available. Secondly, what is available tends to be a lot face-to-face interactions. If there would be, ways to make it more digitized, for instance, we didn't have an opportunity to invite them, but there is a service, we know, I can't remember which country now, but what they do is they have a credit rating system, because there is no credit bureau in the country. They have a credit rating system which you do via cell phone. So any lender can log onto this information platform and basically obtain the credit rating of the microfinance client that is sitting there. So there is a lot of opportunities, both in terms of how you, how you manage your risks, how you can appraise the client, and how you can actually reach the client with the services. And this is also where the e-wallet comes in as one of possible for transactions and other financial services. So on my side, thank you very much. That completes it. Thank you.